Okay. All right. Now tonight I see a Lisa's iPhone, and I don't know. I don't recognize Lisa's iPhone. So you can either unmute yourself and tell me who Lisa's iPhone is, or just send me a text, send me a private message, or however you want to do that. I'm just curious. I tell you, tonight was I mean, we're trying to get ready for this, and then Tuesday night we're going to have our corporate um, Passover, and so we've been loading up the pickup today with all the stuff that goes into doing a Passover for. I think we're up to about 160 people or something like that now, and so I almost said, you know what, I don't know if I can get all this stuff done today and still load up the truck and all that. So, but we did, got it all done, and so we're good to go tonight, and we're still putting stuff in the truck. It's amazing, because Pat does such a great job of decorating the tables, and she puts, he's got this hurricane lamp in the middle, in crystal thingy in the middle that you got a candle inside, and uh, crystal looking, or I think crystal or silver looking candle holder, and then uh, some kind of a mirrored plate, and then she's got a great Seder plate that she puts out there. Makes it very, very fancy. And so um, she she really enjoys doing it and getting doing some of that stuff. So anyway, it's just a great time, and so hopefully we'll have some folks that have not come before, and they will find it meaningful. I know a good bit of our congregation are new to Messianic Judaism, and so as a result, they've never done a Passover before. Certainly not one in their homes, and so that's one of the things. If we can get them to, if they come to one of ours, and then they'll know how to do a Passover in their own home, and it's not that difficult to do it at home, and plus there's um, you don't need to stress out about it because it's pretty easy to do. All right, so I think we definitely have a minion here, and it's 7:03. So I'm going to go ahead and get cranking on this, and we'll begin with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok v'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in words of Torah. Okay, so I want to welcome everyone in tonight for this study on Hebrews chapter 5. And for those who are new and that I don't recognize here, or if you're just checking in with us, my name is Steve Sheik. I'm the congregation leader, rabbi, whatever, at Tree of Life Messianic Congregation we meet in Katy, Texas. And so we're just glad to have you aboard with us tonight. And so without any further ado, we can jump into it. Are there any comments or questions that somebody wanted to say tonight? And while you're doing that, I'm gonna punch one more button here, and and get this stuff shared to my other page. Now, after Passover, we're going to go to a different kind of platform or something that's going to allow me to just post all these things on numerous platforms all at once and don't have to be punching a bunch of buttons. So anyway, all right, Lisa, I see you got your phone unmuted there. Can you let me know who you are? Introduce yourself. Or not? That's okay. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get started here. So tonight's title is called Yeshua, our Kohen Gadol. Kohen Gadol, for those of you that are new to Hebrew and new to um, uh, Messianic Judaism, that is the high priest. Kohen Gadol is the high priest. Kohen is just a priest. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with the first verse. For every Kohen Gadol taken from among men is appointed to act on behalf of people in matters relating to God, so that he may offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. All right, so you may remember that the last week, the last three chapters, or last three verses of last week's chapter 4, just started mentioning the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, and so now he continues on with this, and if I was in charge of rearranging the book of Hebrews, I would change the chapter structure just a little bit so that chapter 4 would have ended at verse 15, and then we'd have picked up or 16, and we'd have picked right up from there and gone to verse 5, or chapter 5, verse 10, and then that would have been the whole shooting match for the Kohen Gadol, except for the fact that then the writer keeps on going with the high priest analogy through other chapters too. So anyway, so to make it easier for everybody, we just stick with the English version, or the version that has come down to us through the ages. So the author sets about describing the characteristics and functions of the high priest, and verse 1 states that every high priest was chosen from among mortals. Well, yeah, where else would they have come from? So I mean, they were a human priest. He's chosen on behalf of other human beings to go before the Lord and deliver specific offerings for the covering of their sins. And an important part of the author's argument is that although priests are called forth to serve the people of Israel, the function they serve actually affects all of humanity. While the Levitical priesthood would definitively serve the community of Israel, that's who they were called for, and that's where they did their work, it did play a role for all of mankind as well, by Israel being, after all, they were called to serve as God's representatives to the nations of the world at large. I mean, Israel was called to be a light to the nations. So who is it then that is bringing about the interaction between the people and God? Well, that was the priesthood of Israel that served in the temple. So the job of the high priest, it says that he was to offer, in the Greek, it's dorate kai thusias, and it means gifts and sacrifices, and they would offer those things before God for the covering of sins. Now, this phraseology of gifts and sacrifices is actually unique to Alexandrian Judaism, or the Jews that were in Alexandria, Egypt. And so, I mean, they use that term. And so some people will use that phrase as evidence that the author was from Alexandria, and of course, who was the one of the important folks from Alexandria, and that was Apollos. And so that's why they would ping on that to see if or to advance the idea that Apollos was the writer of Hebrews. But then again, God only knows, and He's not telling. All right. So also, I guess if we do have some new folks here, I saw that if you have anything to say, I've muted everybody because we get a lot of feedback otherwise. But if you have anything to say, just unmute yourself and say away. And it's all totally interactive here. And so you're not going to derail me any more than I already get derailed by looking out the window and seeing that there's deer in the backyard, or I move my feet under my desk and step on a dog or something like that. So that's okay. All right. Verse 2 and 3. He is able to empathize with the ignorant and deluded, since he himself also is subject to weakness. For this reason, he has made offerings for sins, just as for the people, so also for himself. All right, so this is like Martha was saying, it's a little convoluted in the sentence structure and so forth, but I guess in the Greek it makes perfect sense. This human high priest was appointed by God because, well, then he can easily identify with those who were ignorant and deluded. Some translations say ignorant and subject to straying away. And so the word deluded works just fine. And straying away, to me, Joe will remember this. On one of my classmates in a prayer call on Friday had said that he and his wife of 50-something years was that they all, wherever they go, they hold hands. And somebody had asked him about it, and he says, well, we hold hands for two reasons. I hold her hand so that maybe to help her so that she doesn't stumble and fall, and she holds my hand so I don't wander off. And so Pat and I have laughed about that little deal a couple of times since Friday. But the idea of deluded means that they just get a funny issue in their head, and then they just kind of wander off. And so this high priest who was appointed by God was to be a man who knew all the ills of the people he was to intercede for, so that then he could properly convey them before God in the Holy of Holies. And that's why God chose a human being to be the high priest in this. I guess maybe he could have chosen one of his angels to come down and be the high priest, but an angel would not know, who we are, what we are, how we are, because they are a different kind of a being than we are. So the problem confronting the audience here was that the priesthood had really turned into just a political appointment for men who would be puppets of the Roman government. And so you think about some of these guys that came down from the Hasmonean dynasty there, and they were not qualified by education or practice or sometimes even familial connections to actually be a high priest. And we could make an argument that the high priest was much like all of the regular lay people and that they too, I mean, this high priest, he too, um, he was, he was ignorant in some cases, because maybe he didn't know the problems and didn't know how to do all of these things, and so he could kind of wander off the reservation too. In fact, a lot of these guys that were in the priesthood during the time of Yeshua in the temple were they were grafters. I mean, they were there to pad their pockets, and so it was just a tough time for the people when you have folks like that are trying to, or that are supposed to represent them to God. And so they were not doing a very, very good job of it. But even if a guy was trying to do well and so forth, he had to offer sacrifices for his own sins and for the sins of his family. So in this service, in the service that the high priest had to do on Yom Kippur, he would be required to not only offer a sacrifice for the sin of the people, but he had to begin it with offering atonement and sin offering for himself, for his own mortal limitations, his own moral inadequacies, and so the instructions that we see in Leviticus 16 state that Aaron says, shall offer the bull of the sin offering, which is for himself, and make atonement for himself and for his household, and he shall slaughter the bull of the sin offering, which is for himself. Okay, so Aaron, as the first high priest, had to offer up a sacrifice for his house, and this obviously was passed down through the generations to his successors. And in Second Temple times, the Mishnah specifies that three specific sets of sacrifices were to be offered by the high priest on Yom Kippur. So, first of all, there was a sacrifice that was offered on behalf of the high priest. We've been talking about that, for his own sins. It was a bull and those of his house. And so he would go around and he would offer the sacrifice. In fact, he would sprinkle the blood around the Holy of Holies, and because he was making atonement even for the room in the Holy of Holies. That's what the Bible says. So then, number two, the high priest would offer sacrifices on the behalf of all of the other priests, all of the priesthood, the Levites, and then he would finally get to offer a sacrifice for the people of Israel, and so then that would atone for their sins for that year going for and that they just completed, and then they would go forward with a clean slate. So one of the guys that's written a lot about Hebrews, a guy named William L. Lane, said that the author here asserts that the high priest oneness with other men and women in human weaknesses and needs was kept alive by his continual obligation to make atonement offerings for himself as well. And as for others in Israel, you're not you're sure the Messiah, Yeshua the Messiah, however, now serving as high priest, was without sin and thus did not need to offer a sacrifice for himself. Okay, let's say that again, and without the highfalutin notes. The high priest, because he was a man and because he was fallible just like everybody else, he had to offer sacrifices for himself and for the people. And that's what kept that connection alive. But now we have Yeshua came along. He was the perfect sacrifice. He was without sin, and so he never had to offer another sacrifice for himself. He took on the sins of mankind once and for all. Okay, so as the Son of God, Yeshua the Messiah is able to fulfill and even go beyond, transcend that original role of a Levitical priest. And we see that in verse 6 there, that Yeshua's priesthood begins with that of what? Melchizedek, it says, Melchizedek. And you remember Melchizedek in Genesis, he was the priesthood of Melchizedek looked forward to the day, it looked forward to the Levitical priesthood of Aaron and beyond. He was a precursor. And Yeshua's priesthood is summarized by his divine appointment from the Father, his perfect humanity, his ability to sympathize with men and women. Because why? He had participated in being a human being. He knew all about our humanity and how we function and how we feel. And so then finally, his sacrificial work for sinners defined his whole being. And so Yeshua, in no uncertain terms, is truly portrayed by the author of Hebrews as the ultimate high priest. Okay? So, anybody got any questions on that? Then we'll...
Rabbi?
Yes.
Did Paul at that time have to make a distinction between the high priest and the priest because of the Roman influence?
Paul, you mean the writer of Hebrews?
I'm sorry, yes.
No, well, I think the thing is he was just concentrating on the high priest because that is what Yeshua became, as he wasn't just another priest or another Levite, because he was not a Levite. He was from the tribe of Judah. And so then God, as we'll see later on in the study, appointed him to be the not only he's going to be the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, he's also going to be our high priest, and he has been for the last 2,000 years. Okay. So he didn't make a distinction between that because he's not really talking about any of the other priests. He's talking only about the high priest, and outside of the historical context of what was going on in Israel at the time.
Okay. I was just wondering because of the Roman influence and they possibly picking
Right.
priests. And so he didn't want
Right.
the people to be confused as to who legitimately should be the high priest or is the high priest. Yeah.
Well, and if we're talking about on earth, Yeshua could never be the high priest on earth in his earthly ministry. Not legitimately, because he was from the tribe of Judah. He was not a Levite. Right. But with his death, resurrection, and ascension, he is no longer tied to the earth. He now is the high priest in the heavenly model, in the heavenly tabernacle, in the heavenly temple. And so he's no longer tied to the requirement to be from the tribe of Levi.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So, verse 4, and no one takes this honor for himself, but only when he is called by God, as Aaron was. All right. So the author here, he emphasizes that nobody assumes the office on his own authority. They don't run for office. They can't, well, they're not supposed to be appointed by anybody but God, just as Aaron was. And I think throughout the ages, how that worked is if there were, it was strictly like whoever the high priest was. Well, then when he had a son, his oldest son then was next in line for that position of being the high priest. And so if there was, for some reason or another, a high priest who did not have any sons, then it would go down to, they would figure out another connection there, and then the high priest then, I guess, would go into the temple, and ask the Lord, okay, is Yochanan ben Zechariah, whatever the guy's name was, whoever it was, it says, is this the guy that's supposed to be our next high priest after I'm dead and gone? Because I'm fading fast. And so he'd reach into his the pocket behind his ephod and breastplate, and he'd pull out one of the Urim and Thummim, and whichever one he pulled out, it was either the yes or no, and that's how they made decisions back in those days with yes and no, the Urim and Thummim. Okay, so the understanding of Yeshua needing to be a high priest should have been very easy for for this first century audience that we have here. Because they understood the problems that the high priest often caused for the Jewish people during that time frame. You look at guys like that was there, Caiaphas, and his father and his son, and they just they were no good nicks, and so they caused problems for the people. And in Messiah's day, the Sadducees, they were corrupt, and they had pretty much usurped the office of high priest. I mean, they ran the show. Everything temple oriented was orchestrated by the Sadducees. And if you remember right, the Sadducees were a party of the Jewish religious hierarchy that were strictly, we would call it sola scriptura today, which means only what is written down in Scripture. They only took the first 5 books of the Bible. They did not consider anything else after that. All of the Psalms, Proverbs, all the writings, all the prophets and all their writings, that did not reach the level of Torah. And so they just pretty much rejected all of that. They did not believe in the resurrection of the body at the end of the world. And then the other major religious party was the Pharisees, and the Sadducees were called the Tzedekим, the righteous ones, and the Pharisees were called the Pushim. And so the role of the high priest in this first century time frame that they're writing about had become a political appointment. It really didn't matter how well qualified or how poorly qualified you were. If you got the ear of the Roman government and promised them what they wanted, then you too could be a high priest, And so the Pharisees in particular were they were outraged at the power that the high priest wielded, and how it led to just corruption and disdain. If you read some of the writings that were like in the Mishnah and other contemporary writings, you could see how much they really scorned the Sadducees and their keeping of the temple. Just the way that they operated everything. So, all right, going ahead to, I didn't change that. But I covered all of those things. All right, verse 5 and 6. So also Messiah did not glorify himself to become Kohen Gadol. Rather, it was God who said to him, You are my son. Today I have become your father. And he says in a different passage, you are a Kohen forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. All right. So it's a fairly significant contrast now to how the role of the high priest, had largely been, it was usurped in the first century. Yeshua then, as a Messiah, he didn't exalt himself to make, he didn't politic to be made a high priest. He was not seeking to be a high priest, but because of Yeshua's divine connection, his divine sonship, he can serve as both the Redeemer and a high priest. But the work he performs is notably done by way of appointment of God, appointment by his Father. So Yeshua's calling as high priest is justified by the author by two psalms. He used two psalms as proof text here. And the first one was I think we've already seen it in chapter 1, verse 5, is from Psalms 2:7. It says, "You are my son; today I have become your father." Then the second psalm that the author uses to prove his point says it's in Psalms 110 and 4. It says, "You are a Kohen forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." So Yeshua, having been incarnated or born into the world of mortals, as he is one to be worshipped and the one who rules alongside his Father. And he's the one that is appointed to this permanent priestly office that they said is after the order of Melchizedek. And so I think I've said it further down in my notes, but I'll say it again here, that the idea of the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek was I say strange person, not so much strange, but mystical. We don't know that much about him other than he was the priest, God's priest in Salem, which is Jerusalem, at the time of Abraham. And so when Abraham went and defeated the 5 kings that had taken Lot and his family captive, he came back through, and this priest, this high priest of the Lord in Jerusalem, came out to meet Abraham and brought him bread and wine. And so a lot of people make the connection there that at the Last Supper, Yeshua brought out bread and wine for his disciples, and so, but it says that the Melchizedek, they don't know where he had, what his beginning was, and they don't know what his ending was. And so some people say, well, Melchizedek was a pre-incarnate Messiah, pre-incarnate Christ, Yeshua, whatever. And I'm not sure that I go along with that particular idea, but he's just kind of shrouded in some mystery. We don't know who he was really, but there's something that he was. If he wasn't immortal, he was there for a long time, and so then it gives us that idea of course, he's a priest of God, but then Melchizedek, it has that same idea of permanency, that it's not going away. His priesthood was not going away, whereas the earthly priesthood, we know now it has gone away. We no longer have a temple, so we no longer have priests serving in the temple, and that's liable to change here pretty soon when they build a new temple. All right, so verse 7. In the days of his life on earth, Yeshua offered up prayers and pleas with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Okay, what makes Yeshua the Messiah, the able high priest, is that in the days of his life on earth, Yeshua offered up prayers and pleas. So he kind of functioned in a way. The author uses that a Greek word, and I'm going to stumble over it here, in tes hemerais tes sarkos, meaning in the days of his life on earth. And so he's emphasizing the historical fact that Yeshua was on the earth, and he lived out a very genuine human experience. He was just, the Bible says he was just like you and me. And while Yeshua was on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears, it says. And we know that the Bible records some places where right before his execution, that he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, or Gethsemane in Hebrew, that is said that he was so intense with his prayers that the sweat dropped off of him like big drops of blood. And some people have posited that no, he was really so intense that he was sweating blood. And so we have differences of opinion on that, where the Bible says it was like great drops of blood. And whether it was blood or not, he had to be identified by Judas, when he was in the garden and they brought the guards to take him away. He didn't look like anybody else, and if he'd been bleeding through his pores, you'd think that he would have looked a mess with blood all over him, and they could have figured that one out. But anyway, we know that he spent a lot of time in prayer. He would go off into private places while the disciples were doing their thing, and he would go up in the mountains and just time of prayer. So he was really known in the Gospels for his prayer connections. All right. So verse 8, though he was a son, he learned obedience from what he suffered. All right, now this is a little strange here. This I have to admit that. Okay, how do we unwrap this one? So the author of Hebrews he's kind of an interesting transition in his argument, writing that even though Yeshua was God's son, he learned obedience from the things he suffered. Now, so makes you kind of wonder that, okay, if the son is a legitimate part of the Godhead along with the Father, then why would Yeshua have to learn anything at all? I mean, if he was God, certainly God knows all things. But what they're talking about here is not the issue and the view of whether, it's not the omniscience of God, but rather it's the personal experience in humanity of being a human and suffering that gave Yeshua a direct involvement, and could only have been brought about by being human. God could have just said to Yeshua, okay, I'm going to give you all these emotions of being a human, even though you're never going to be a human. But he didn't. He made Yeshua a human being. He's 100% man, 100% God. But by doing that, he experienced what we have. And so he learned obedience. It says he learned obedience, or he learned how it was to just face through and go through all the turmoil and troubles that human beings do because of what he did suffer. And so Yeshua participated in the human experience, and because of this, he can readily identify with human beings before the Father. He's the high priest. He can bring our petitions and needs to the Lord, to the Father, and maybe even more importantly, people then should be able to more readily identify with Yeshua. Yeshua, having come to earth to die for human sins, no longer makes God distant and detached from the human beings he created. Because why? He's the Son of God. He came down to earth as a human being. All right. All right, we'll go ahead. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Okay, how do we talk about this idea of Yeshua being made perfect? Well, wasn't he already sinless? And so, how could he be perfect? And I think it's a case of how we look at the wording here. It's kind of like where God says, "Okay, all you people of mine, you are to be holy, just as I am holy." Something that used to just trouble me as when I was growing up. How can I be holy like God is holy? Because I know me, and I am definitely not a holy person. But what he was saying was, be separated out, be out from the world. That's what holiness is to be separated away from the world and separate and you're set aside for the Lord. And so this is the kind of the idea of the perfection of Yeshua. So his experience of being a human being, it perfected Yeshua in the sense that it completed him as our great high priest. It was, it's kind of a funny way to do it, but he had to go through being a human so he could pick up all of his human merit badges, and then that made him uh, perfectly suitable and qualified to be the high priest for all of humankind, is because he had himself been a human. His personal experience, his personal knowledge of what humans have to endure. So obeying God in this verse means trusting him. And Yeshua is, of course, the source of eternal, not just temporary salvation to all who believe in him. And so he might, in view of the writer's emphasis here, it may be that he was also referring here to the ultimate aspect of our salvation, our eternal inheritance. So we obtain this to the extent that we obey God. If you, obviously, the better and the more that you obey God, the closer you are to him, and the closer you are to what he wants you to be. So major reason that early Jewish believers suffered was because they chose to follow Yeshua. Okay, had they not followed Yeshua, they would not have suffered a lot of the things that they did. And today, believers face the temptation to play down their commitment to Messiah in the face of persecution of various kinds. Meaning that, okay, some people will just kind of like Peter at the trial of Yeshua. No, I'm not part of him. I'm not one of those guys. And so I just know that years ago I was an officer on a Coast Guard cutter, and it had been our practice for a good long time on this ship, that when all of the officers got together for their meal, that someone in the of the officers, and it kind of rotated around, for those that wanted to do it, would they would ask a blessing or say grace over the meal. Well, we got a new captain, new commanding officer, and the first meal that we had, it fell to me to offer the prayer at the meal. And so I did a prayer, and he's just kind of standing there just looking at me and looking around. Everybody's got their head bowed, and he's just kind of looking at me. And he says, "What are you, some kind of a Jesus freak or something?" And so a person would be kind of, in a military situation like that, you'd be kind of tempted to say, "Well, no, that's just one of our practices. We did that, it's not a big deal." No. And yeah, I let him know that I said, "Well, I don't know if I'm so freaky, but yes, I'm a follower of Jesus, and yeah, I am." And so we had kind of a prickly relationship for the next year with that guy, because he just was having none of it, and so he used to, punch my buttons because of that every once in a while. But it's something that needed to be done, and so I lived through it, and a lot of people, it helped me make me a little bit better guy, I guess. But a lot of people would just say, "Man, not me, no, you're just," and it's a temptation to do that. So, but because of Yeshua's obedience to his father, ultimately, leading to his death, the author of Hebrews concludes that he, Yeshua, became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. And so I got some other stuff about the Greek word that they used here is aitios, and it means being the cause or responsible for, mainly instrumental in causing. And so an important usage of this term, aitios, is a scene where the Jewish philosopher you may have heard of in Philo, Philo, and he describes the brazen serpent up in the wilderness. When the snakes were killing the Israelites because of their murmuring and complaining and stuff. And so he describes a brazen serpent in the wilderness. He writes that he writes of the snake becoming a cause or an atrios of complete safety if you could get up and look on that snake. And so Yeshua is being lifted up as certainly, typified by the serpent in the wilderness. So he's just saying, okay, just like the people looked at the serpent in the wilderness and they were healed, people who look to Yeshua for their salvation, they will have their salvation. So it's also connected to Isaiah, and I think it's 45:17. We looked at it a few weeks ago when we were in the book of Isaiah. It says, "Israel has been saved by the Lord with an everlasting salvation. You will not be put to shame or humiliated to all eternity." And so it's not enough, though, to recognize the great effects of Yeshua's humiliation, his execution, and his resurrection, and then his ascent into heaven. What is required is our obedience to the Lord. If we, for those of us who receive his salvation, then it's incumbent upon us to live in obedience to him. All right. So going ahead to verse 10, called by God, Kohen Gadol, according to the order of Melchizedek. Okay, so we're kind of doing a little bit of repeating here. And Messiah's priesthood is portrayed as like being the work of Melchizedek, as we've talked about. He was designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. We know that he he encountered the patriarch Abraham, and Abraham knew who he was and considered him a very important person. He tithed to Melchizedek. And so this priesthood preceded Moses and the Aaronic order. And many believers have concluded that, Yeshua's priestly service renders the Aaronic priesthood, of no importance, but that's not true. Okay. It does not, it's not the issue of Yeshua's appointment as a high priest after that order of Melchizedek. It's something that he legitimately inherited as a descendant of David. So he's just following a line that God had made Melchizedek earlier on, before the Aaronic priesthood, and then he carried it on through Yeshua, then through all time, and even into eternity. And so you got to think about it. Yeshua's priesthood was there was nothing like it ever encountered or heard of before. Even, I mean, his was they said after the order of Melchizedek. Yeah, but it was far greater than Melchizedek. And remember, Yeshua was the one who was there at the creation. Melchizedek was not. And so Yeshua's priesthood had a precedent established prior to the founding of Israel as a nation. And in fact, it's a much more ancient priesthood. Okay, so let's see. I want to go back because I'd struggle with this. The order of Melchizedek speaks not only to the antiquity of his priesthood, but the eternal nature of Yeshua's priesthood. Okay. Yeah, when I was writing that, I was struggling to try to make the connection between those two. So I wanted to go ahead and write that or read that again. Okay. All right. So verse 11. About this subject, there is much for us to say, and it's hard to explain since you have become sluggish in hearing. Oh boy. Okay. So what is the writer of Hebrews saying here? He was talking about Yeshua's appointment as a priest, and then he shifts. Man, it just gives him whiplash for a few minutes. Now, remember that this book of Hebrews was written most likely to be read out loud as a sermon or a speech. Okay, others were like letters that you studied, but this was to be delivered as a speech, and to address his audience spiritual condition and why they were having problems that they had. So that's what he had to shift gears here a little bit and then jump on this idea of, okay, but why aren't you getting this? And so he said, I'd really like to talk more about Melchizedek. And he says, about Melchizedek, we have much to say, much that is difficult to explain to you. And that was in one of the revised, I think the Revised English Bible was where that was. And so I think the Holman Christian Bible says that they translated, said that the audience was slow to understand. And so there is a connection between our spiritual condition and our understanding. And it's not particularly, it's not a case of intellect either. I mean, you can be the most intellectual person around, but if you're not spiritually connected to what the Lord is trying to tell you, you're going to have a hard time picking up on it. So it's a case of a problem of communication, like the warden in Cool Hand Luke. What we have here is a failure to communicate. And so many in the Hebrews audience did not have the capacity to hear some of the true points of insight, some of the finer points about Melchizedek and how Messiah fulfills this priesthood. The term that the author used in the Greek was he used a Greek word called nothros, which means sluggish or obtuse, and so they're just not paying attention. Sometimes is what. Sometimes I look at people that are in the stores or on the roads or whatever, and my word for them is they're oblivions, because they're just oblivious to what's going on around them. And so and some have said that this is because they lacked um, the vitality, the life of an assured and a persevering faith. So their faith was kind of suffering. So what was the writer trying to tell them? That were they not deep thinkers, or the points taken from these points? They're not only important for them, for the readers back in those days, but it's important for us today too, in our world, to not fall into a what do they call it, a condition of spiritual stupor. Okay, you don't want to fall out the window at 3 o'clock in the morning. So going on, for although you ought to be teachers by this time, again, you need someone to teach you the basics of God's sayings. You have come to milk, not solid food. They come to need milk and not solid food. All right, so the author of Hebrews begins a series of chastisement of his audience, and he used some pretty significant severe criticism for anyone who is listening. So he said, by this time you should be the ones who are going out and teaching, and you're supposed to be teachers. So if our author was a companion of the Apostle Paul, and he was writing to various groups that Paul had influence over, he would be reflecting on the fact that these people have been in the Messiah faith long enough that they should be teachers, as Paul had already given them adequate training. I mean, he had taught them well, and now they're still going. They're still like the baby that won't eat anything but just his the milk that they feed him. So he said, you ought to be teachers, not sitting here like you are. But for the most part, they were not mature enough to be teachers, and they found themselves still needing to relearn. I put it there, relearn the ABCs, the gospel ABCs, relearn what it was that Paul had taught, and what Peter had taught, what the disciples had taught. And so and he's not only talking to Hebrews, he's talking to each of us and everything today, that when we are given the word of God, then we need to start living it, working it, and so that we know what we can grow in the word and understand what's important in our lives and what's important that God wants us to do. And so I find that some of the most difficult people to reach today with the good news of Yeshua is not necessarily the poor people or those in third world countries who know they need something more. No, it's the rich and the highly educated in the world who think that they have it all put together, and actually they don't. Okay, some of the most highly educated people in the world are also the most ignorant people in the world, because without accepting Yeshua as their personal savior, they're going to go into an eternity of hell and torment, and that's a horrible thing. But you don't have to listen very, very far, very hard to some of these university presidents that are, Ivy League universities and others that they're talking trash because they just don't know. They're just ignorant of what's really important in the world. So the author of Hebrews is not talking about, he was not speaking to a bunch of uneducated dummies. He's talking to educated folks, and he's just getting onto them and says, you got all this knowledge and you're unable to use it. You have to be going back to the beginning again. Don't be that guy. And it's for anyone living on milk is inexperienced with the teaching about righteousness, he is an infant. All right. And David Stern, who wrote the Complete Jewish Bible translation, observed that how the author of Hebrews has a difficult time dispensing the information on how Yeshua's high priesthood goes beyond the Levitical priesthood, and his own personal death goes beyond the temple and the tabernacle system. And so even today in the Messianic community, we have issues with the spiritually immature who cannot handle the writings in Hebrews, and in fact, or in Paul's writings and so forth, because they get these crazy ideas about whatever it is that they're wanting to do, and like one of them said, I'd said to a guy here a few years ago, we were having a discussion on certain requirements in the Bible, and I said, well, look, this is what Paul said in Galatians, to the Galatians, in black and white. Boom, boom, boom. And the guy says, yeah, but that's not what Paul really meant to say, I'm sure. And so, they just won't accept what the word says. And so that's why we have to be willing to just look at the word, and whether we like it or not, accept it. This idea up there that he talked about with the teaching about righteousness in the King James Version, I think it says the word of righteousness has been equated by Polycarp. He was a successor to John in the apostle. He wrote about the word of righteousness as a euphemism for being willing to die for the faith. Okay. And so the audience here they were so immature that he said, well, you are so immature, you're not even willing to, if it came to it, you don't have the faith to die for your faith. That when you face persecution, and when you face the possibility of death, then you're going to crumble. You're just going to fall away from it. And I can't help but think of when ISIS was running amok over there in the Middle East, and they came across a group of Christians in I think it was in Iraq or Iran, someplace over there, and they were trying to get these children as young as 12 years old to recant their faith in Yeshua, and 12 years old, and these kids would not recant. And so what did they do? They crucified them, literally crucified these kids in front of their parents, and then the parents would certainly, they upheld their faith in Yeshua. And so today, those people are sitting there at the throne of Yeshua, at the throne of God, and they're just waiting for the rest of us to complete our earthly mission. But they are there as martyrs because they refuse to let go of their faith. And so these Hebrews had not trained their own faculties, their own bodies or whatever, their minds. They had not trained themselves to be steadfast in the faith. And so he's just trying to get them to, okay, hang on to it, because I don't want you to fall back into where you were before. And so finally, the last verse in this chapter here, but solid food is for the mature, who through practice have their senses trained to discern both good and evil. All right. What I see here is that these guys, it says they had not trained themselves to be able to distinguish between good and evil, and so they would have trouble determining what is right and what's wrong. And I see this all the time today, where people will come to me and said, well, I read on the internet that such and such and such, so and so said this, and my retort back to them, my comeback to them always is, okay, what does the Bible say in black and white? Show me in black and white what the Bible says. And don't be quoting Rabbi Google or Pastor Alexa or whatever the person is. Don't be quoting them and what they say, but come back and tell me what it says in the Bible in black and white. Then we'll have a discussion. When we were trying to figure out, I'm trying to line out things for counting the Omer starting next week. Well, actually starting this week on Tuesday night. Ran across this deal where somebody had decided that, well, the Jews got their own calendar wrong, and but we figured out through scientific computers and stuff that we know now when the world was created and at what hour it was, and da 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 da. And so basically their idea of what what the calendar is anywhere from 2 weeks to a month off of how we celebrate our services, and like the new moons and the feasts, and so on and so forth. So it just one of those kind of deals where that confuses people. And I've had people come up to me and say, yeah, but we've proven scientifically that the Jews don't know what the true Sabbath really was. And okay, so that, I'll have to admit, that is a trigger for me, because Jewish people for centuries have been persecuted and put to death because they kept the Sabbath. And so you don't forget when the Sabbath is, and then lose your life because of it. So anyway, that's what the writer here is talking to these guys about, that you have to practice what you see and put it into practice. And one of the things I like that this faith, maturing in the faith is proactive, and it's not passive. God didn't call us to tuchus ministry, meaning he didn't call us to come to synagogue or come to church and sit on your tuchus in the pew and, okay, I've got my check. I've checked off this week's bucket list. I've been to church. I've been to synagogue. Okay, I'm good to go for the next week. And God didn't call us to that. He called us out to present the gospel to people, to be that person in the world that people will come to when they need spiritual uplifting. And that's what he's called us to do. He said we were created for good works. And okay, it's 9 minutes after 8, and I started preaching. Okay, so I will shut it down for tonight. Anyway, any comments or questions that someone may have? I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, so that that way you're not don't have to worry about